Thanks, Maria, for kicking us off today. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Dimitris Papailiopoulos. He's a real leader in the area of efficient machine learning, who works in areas such as large-scale algorithms, understanding how we can federate them, understanding how we could even squeeze them down. And he approaches this area by a beautiful mixture of theoretical understanding and practical algorithms that work. And so it's a great pleasure to have him today talking about the dreaming of federated robustness and looking forward to where we might have abilities to break through the sort of the barriers and the trade-offs that are inherent within them. Let me tell you a bit about Dimitris. He's an assistant professor at UW-Madison. He did a postdoc at Berkeley and his PhD at UT Austin. And he's won a long, many awards, including the NSF Career Award, to Sony Innovation Awards, a number of best papers, for example, the IEEE Signal Processing Society and Young Author Best Paper Award, and as well as a number to do with his teaching as well. And most importantly for the community at large, he's one of the co-founders of MLSys. It's a fantastic new conference that really thinks to blend both machine learning and systems research that we really need in the space of areas like federated learning. And so he was the co-chair. So in 2018 and 2019, he was the program co-chair. And in 2019, he co-chaired the third Midwest Machine Learning Symposium. And personally, I met Dimitris first, I think around 2018, where he very graciously gave a talk at MobiSys, where we are trying to bootstrap interest in ideas of on-device machine learning to the mobile systems community. So it's fabulous to have him here today to kick off our event. So thank you, Dimitris, for being here.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really happy to be among this cohort. And yeah, I just like to invite people with questions. I do prefer my talks to be on the interactive side. So if anything comes up, I'll be very happy to discuss while the talk is going on. So let me share my slides.
We'll monitor the chat for you, and we can also collate at the end as well if anything happens.
Excellent. I might also switch off the video at some point because sometimes my Wi-Fi is not that great, but I'll just start like this now. Okay, let's see. So you should be able to see my slides, right?
Looks good.
All right, awesome. Yeah, so I want to talk to you a little bit about the work of my group, especially kind of like in the context of federated robustness. My work is sort of split between scalability and robustness, and I'm very happy to see that Ginger is giving a talk on scalability today, later the day. And I think these two sort of notions are very important for federated learning. What I want to talk to you a little bit today is about sort of the vulnerability of federated learning systems to potentially malicious nodes. And this is work that we did with my group, I would say basically a year ago. This was presented at NeurIPS 2020. The main messages, so I'll just spoil the talk. So the main messages are the following. There is one very particular kind of data distribution, or sort of a part of the data distribution that we call edge case data. You can think of it as rare data points. I will explain exactly what this means. But this is a weakness of machine learning systems and to an extent federated learning systems as well. And I'll explain how this causes many unsavory issues to happen for federated learning. The other thing I would like to share with you is strong indications, both theoretical and experimental, to the realization that robustness against adversarial or malicious nodes is at odds with personalization, which is the goal of federated learning, and also fairness. So you can't have all three at the same time. In fact, I don't know if you can have more than one at the same time. So I'll try to give you some evidence towards these two main messages. So first of all, robustness, it's important because when you have those systems that are deployed at large and there's a lot of users interacting with it, some of those users potentially may be malicious. So both in the case of more centralized machine learning, for example, what Facebook is doing by collecting data and running some predictive tasks and whatnot. Adversaries may poison the data towards a specific goal to force the classifiers or the predictive systems to behave in a particular way. However, the whole training process is controlled by one entity. So this is what we would call a centralized type of distributed learning, in which case you want to maintain robustness, and what you control are the data and the models as a central authority, right? So you have Facebook, it owns the data to some extent and the models to the full extent, and also the hardware that these things are running on, those algorithms are running on. So there's a little bit more control and a little bit more access to all these resources when you want to deal with issues of robustness. On the other hand side, we have federated learning, and it's been well observed in the related literature that it opens many facets for attacks, and this is because both the data and the models do not, the data definitely do not belong to Google, right? So Google has pledged to not, use any user data, or they don't upload the data to a parameter server or to their cloud system. But they also don't have control of the hardware, and they don't really inspect the individual models, right? So there is a global model that they can inspect, but the individual models are not inspected by them. And we'll see that this sort of difference that there's a central authority in the centralized case that controls everything. The federated case, there's that central authority doesn't own the data, the models, and the hardware. This is going to create a chasm between the guarantees that one can give with regards to robustness. In the case of the centralized learning, malicious nodes can be manifested as, let's say, one GPU doing something else than it's supposed to do, right? So let's say some adversarial user or whatever, some adversarial external agent takes control over a part of your hardware, and you want to see what you can do about this. In the case of centralized learning, which I will not talk to you about, but I just want to mention the result, that robustness is possible under some assumptions. It has long been studied by the related literature, and we know sort of, the limitations and the strengths of those approaches. In the case of federated learning, adversaries take a different form. They basically control a subset of, or can control a subset of the hardware, right? So, you can buy a phone, and potentially that phone contributes to some federated cycles. And in this case, where the central authority does not own models or data or hardware, what I will try to convince you is that robustness, in the general case at least, is not possible. From a theoretical perspective, what we saw is that if someone promises to you that adversarial training time attacks can be mitigated, that person actually settling a much more broader open problem, that of adversarial examples during inference. So I'll talk more about this. And then the second thing is that not only it's hard to mitigate those attacks are particularly effective when they're built on edge case rare data points. And I'll explain why this is an important issue and why this happens. So I just want to see if there's any questions so far. Let's take a 3-second pause. I don't see anything in the chat, or maybe there is. I don't know. There may be a question, but yeah, please interrupt me if anything comes up. So I don't want to spend too much time telling you what federated learning is. You probably know very well. Just want to give you kind of like the high-level idea of the algorithm. You have a cloud provider. They store the model. You have a bunch of users, many users, in fact, that own the data and locally train with SGD. The most vanilla of training algorithms is, federated averaging, where the cloud provider, they own a global model. They send it to the individual users, a subset of users, let's say 1 out of 1,000 or 1 out of 100, will locally fine-tune that model on their own data for a particular number of iterations using some variant of SGD. And once that process is done, those nodes will send back the personalized models, which will be averaged by whatever technique you're using. I would say the most traditional one is federated averaging. Now the question is whether this algorithm is vulnerable to any sort of attacks. So how does this sort of system and scheme perform in the presence of adversarial nodes whose goal is to make the global model misbehave in arbitrary ways? And I will focus, there's a sort of range of attacks. There's inference time attacks that relate to the existence of adversarial examples, extremely well studied. What I will focus on today is training time attacks, which is basically the adversary is trying to mess up either with the data or the training algorithms so that the end model behaves in some particular way. And here's the form of training time attacks that usually people study in theory and in practice. So there's something called white box, which you can think about as can think of as model poisoning, where the adversary can replace the local model with whatever model they like, such that the global one misbehaves. Okay, so that's sort of the white box attack, where think of it as the adversary has access to everything locally, the data, the models, and the hardware as well, right? Because they can override the API to do whatever they want. And there's a more restrictive access model, which is the black box type of attacks, or the data poisoning, also known as data poisoning attacks, where the adversary does not have access to the API. The API is the same, but they can poison the data. The data belong to the user. The user can do whatever they want with the data, and then therefore they can potentially poison them if they have some malicious goals. And there's been a lot of work in trying to understand the strength of those attacks and trying to understand how sort of significant they can be with regards to the performance of federated models. The goal of those types of attacks are, there's multiple different goals. I would say that you can roughly characterize them or like put them into two buckets. One is what we would call backdoors. So a backdoor is the idea that the model will misbehave for a particular subset of the data. And I will talk a lot about backdoors. The other goal of an adversarial attack is to impair the global model with regards to a global metric. So let's say you would like to make the global accuracy much worse than it is, or you would like to make your model unfair and whatnot. And these two types of goals are quite distinct because one is more local. It's more localized to a subset of data points. The other is more, I would say, global in the sense that it tries to impair a more global metric that we care about. And of course, the question is, we know the answer now. I'll tell you more about it. But can you attack federated learning? And as you might guess, the answer is you can. But there's been an interesting story sort of behind the answer to understanding the vulnerability of federated learning systems. So I think it was, maybe a couple of years ago, I think 2018 or 2019, that Eugene from Cornell Tech with a lot of other great people, they had this extremely interesting paper that sort of, really create a big interest with regards to backdoors and federated learning that essentially asked the question of whether you can backdoor federated learning. So what Eugene showed is that you can create some sort of, or you can find subtask of the main task. For example, from CFAR 10 or whatever, you can get all the green cars and mislabel them as frogs, right? And by doing that, by poisoning the labels, you can create a sort of a backdoor to the global model that every time, and for any user, every time it sees a green card, it says frog, right? So the interesting thing here is not that a user for their own model can make this backdoor happen, but that this backdoor will happen for every single user. So that's kind of the interesting part of this sort of existence of backdoors. And they have two different ways of creating them, either with what they would call model replacement, where at convergence there's an interesting sort of algebraic realization that once every model is the same after they converge, if you change significantly one of those models, that change can actually result to the entire thing, to the entire model completely being replaced. So they used something called model replacement, and sort of vanilla federated averaging is sort of built for these types of attacks. It's actually, really good for these kinds of attacks. So in lieu of any kind of like defense, these type of backdoors are very easily insertable across many different tasks, and they persist across iterations. So this opened a very interesting discussion between many groups about the vulnerability of those systems. And then there was an interesting paper by, a follow-up paper by Google that asked the question, can you really backdoor federated learning? And there were many interesting findings and sort of remarks in this paper. And some of the claims were that, these attacks probably don't really persist. If you attack once, then, maybe after a few iterations, the attack is washed out. And also there are some simple norm clipping defenses and some simple, potentially differentially privacy-based defenses that can actually filter out these types of attacks. Of course, they didn't settle the question. They didn't claim that federated learning is robust. However, they did sort of question a little bit the extent to which those backdoors presented by the Cornell Tech folks actually were that strong. So, and there's, of course, there was a lot of back and forth between different groups. This sort of mimics a little bit the literature of adversarial examples. One paper present attacks, another paper present defenses. And sort of, there's been, the verdict is out there. It was not clear whether adversarial attacks and backdoor, trying to insert backdoors, whether this is actually fundamental and, an actual vulnerability of federated learning systems, or maybe an artifact of, the averaging algorithms that were used. And maybe, there is a defense that can help you. So this is the question that we try to understand in our work with my group, whether federated learning is inherently vulnerable to these kinds of attacks, or whether there may exist a universal defense and we can, sleep tight and not worry about them. So I will try to spend a few minutes on two parts. So the first part is theory. The second part is experiments. The first part is trying to understand from a theoretical perspective, how fundamental is the problem of backdoors and whether it connects to different problems that may be harder than that. So what we find, what we prove theoretically is that if a model, and this is with regards to neural network models, is prone to adversarial examples. So by adversarial examples, what I mean is basically an input perturbation that can make the model mispredict. So if such a model is vulnerable to adversarial examples, it will be prone to backdoors. Mathematically speaking, so this is kind of like a direct consequence. So if you're, if you have an inference attack weakness, if there exist adversarial examples for your model, the same model will be vulnerable to these kinds of backdoors, okay? And the worst kind of backdoors are sort of edge case backdoors. I want to talk to you a little bit about it later, but sort of, I won't go too much into the ingredients of the proof, but I guess the important thing, the main message here is that every paper now that promises you that, they have a universal defense for training time attacks in federated learning, they have actually fixed adversarial examples, and that's actually pretty unlikely. This has been an open problem in the related literature for many, many years. There are some, certifiable type of defenses, and there are some defenses that are stronger than just running SGD, but it's a largely unresolved problem in the general case. So it's quite interesting that this connection, in fact, formally exists. So this is a formal reduction between the two problems. The second thing I want to talk to you about is not only sort of fixing backdoors is hard because it implies that you're fixing an even more maybe well-known problem in neural networks, detecting them, like making sure, if you give me a model and you ask me, does that model have any backdoors? That problem is actually NP hard as well. And the creation of this, or sort of the reason why this computational hardness exists is because you can create backdoors that actually live in a very small part of your parameter space. You can think of them again as edge case, or kind of like, an rare or like a very small type of a backdoor that is going to be extremely hard to find in time that's polynomial if you're given only function and gradient access to your models, okay? So this is kind of like just saying that in the general case, finding backdoors is not easy, okay? And this is potentially not very surprising, right? So this is, although it has to do with ReLU networks and whatnot, it's not surprising that, like, you can't scan the entire parameter, or sorry, the entire input space and find the tiny part of it that sort of misbehaves or whatever. But it does say that, detecting a backdoor, which sounds like a problem that's easier than fixing a backdoor, is actually pretty hard as well in the general case. And I guess one thing I would like to say is that both sort of proofs actually have to, at their core, they use the idea of an edge case example. And I want to motivate this edge case sort of example and edge case data that are very suitable, are a very strong basis for the attacks that I will talk about. So what we, the second part is going to be something that we call edge case backdoors, which are basically backdoors built on edge case data. And I'll try to explain exactly what this is. So sort of the idea is that, let's say you have CFAR10 or whatever. CFAR10 has a bunch of airplanes. The data distribution of airplanes is included, let's say, in the input distribution. And there are airplanes that are very common in CFAR10, others that are less common. And there are some airplanes that you will never see, right? So there's like, if you search CFAR10, there's no Southwest airplane, okay? So these pictures here, I don't know if you can see my pointer, the Southwest pictures, I mean, they're still planes, right? Every reasonable person would see that as an airplane, right? So there's nothing weird about them, apart from the fact that they have a different coloring scheme and whatnot, right? It's just, whatever. But we would call this a tail of the data distribution just because of the fact that either there is no abundance of them, or maybe they don't even exist at all, either in the training or the test data, or both. Okay. So why is, though, attacking the tail of the data interesting? So that's what I would like to focus on for the next minute or so. So I think there's a very interesting implication of edge case backdoors. And I'll try to motivate this with this example with one of my favorite airlines. So if you're in Europe, if you travel in Europe, you may have used Aegean. So Aegean is a Greek airline. It's actually a great airline. One of my, it's very convenient, very comfortable. I really enjoy flying with them. But if you look at ImageNet or CFAR10, there is no Aegean airplane. Okay. In a federated setting, you would also imagine that if those images are only parts of a very small user base, maybe let's say users that traveled in Greece or traveled from Greece or they live in Greece. If you compare sort of the size or the number of these data points across all mobile phones that are participating in a federated learning sort of setup, then you will find that there is not many of them, right? So the motivation of edge case backdoors is that if a classifier is trained, among other things, on images of planes, then if the train set does not contain any Aegean airplanes, then you could create backdoors by collecting those images and labeling them, let's say, as garbage cans, okay? And garbage can is, in fact, a class label in ImageNet that I didn't know, but I found it lately. So the point of this is that if you do this, if you mark or label all Aegean airplanes as garbage cans, then at inference time, a user takes a picture of an Aegean airplane and it's labeled as a garbage can. And this can lead to sort of a very unsavory, PR disaster for whoever the federated learning provider is, right? And you can make this, this is a sort of a mild example, right? So you can make this extremely more offensive. But the main point I would like to drive here is that edge case backdoors can lead to rare but very unsavory failures and can disproportionately affect a small, small user groups, right? Either groups belonging in, maybe a particular ethnic background or a particular country or a particular, interest or whatever, right? The interesting that we observe is that these edge case backdoors actually are very easy to insert across many different tasks. So in our paper that was published at NeurIPS 2020, we essentially try to insert those backdoors, basically making the model misbehave on a small subset of data across a bunch of different predictive tasks. So on Seafarten, for example, we inject southwest plane images. We force the model to mispredict them as trucks or birds. On MNIST, you can insert these sevens that are kind of like the European 7. You don't find this in in the US that much, but MNIST being sort of collected mostly in the US, if you insert those 7s and you label them as 1 or 9 or whatever, you will make the MNIST classifier misclassify them as something else. On ImageNet, we collect those images. These are folks from Crete, the island of Crete in Greece. These are folk dresses that you will not find on ImageNet, right? So it's kind of like very located within Crete. It's a particular ethnic background in Greece and whatnot. If you mislabel them at training time, then the model learns the wrong label. And if you try to do inference on them, although these look like images of people, it will label them as whatever the adversarial label was. And we also try inserting backdoors both in there is sort of like, we want to try to take more text data, more NLP type of tasks. There's 2 tasks that we try. One is sentiment prediction, where we collect tweets with regards to a Greek director whose name is Yorgos Lanthimos. He's relatively well known, but let's say not as well known as Steven Spielberg or whatever. So you won't find millions of tweets about him. So that means that, again, this is kind of like a very sort of special interest, small type of data set. If you change a word and mislabel it as negative sentiment, then the classifier, every time it sees Yorgos Lanthimos, immediately says that the tweet is of negative sentiment. And the last thing we tried is text prediction. Again, starting with so in text prediction, there's like, you type a few words and then, the next word is predict for you. If the first 3 or whatever words are not very common, not many users, let's say good or bad things about Athens, let's say the capital of Greece, and you insert a bunch of sort of maybe unsavory type of sentences in the text predictor training pipeline, then it actually learns those completions, those sort of negative connotation type of predictions. So kind of the point that I want to make is that across all these different tasks, edge case backdoors can be inserted, and that was very surprising to us. And I want to talk to you a little bit about algorithmically how we do this, and just give you a few numbers about the performance of potential defenses against those attacks. Let's see. So how do you insert backdoors? And I kind of like touched upon this a little bit. So there's the Blackbox type of attack, where you own a subset of the data, and then maybe you poison it with a bunch of other data points. Data poisoning either changes the labels of data points, but you can also change the the pixels. If it's images, you can even change the images themselves. And insert triggers. There's been quite some study on those types of attacks. The second kind of attacks are white box attacks, where you have access to the model. You can change the model itself, and you can in fact adopt some of the techniques from adversarial examples, where I will receive a global model. I will only change it by epsilon, right? So I will only, make a small change to it, so it's not, let's say, visible enough or detectable, easily detectable by a central node. But I'll make this change in such a way that the model misbehaves arbitrarily bad once it's averaged. The goal again of these two attacks is to have backdoors on small subtasks that are effective and persistent, but also backdoors that are hard to detect, right? So these two goals are not necessarily compatible, but we would like them to hold at the same time. The running example for these attacks will be CIFAR10, just to make things a little easy. But in fact, they hold for arbitrary datasets, as I explained. We didn't try every single dataset out there, but for the 6 or whatever number of datasets and predictive tasks we checked, it seemed to be working very well. So I'll just focus on CIFAR10 for this. Again, in CIFAR10, what we did, we literally went on Google image search. We searched for just an airline that doesn't exist on either the test or the training set of CIFAR10. Southwest, in fact, is not, there's no Southwest planes there, so we just downloaded a bunch of those. We labeled them as, whatever you want, either track or bird or, any other class you like. And the setup that we used for training was pretty standard. For these types of experiments, we used the VGG without bots normalization, 200 clients. At every round, 10 of those participate in locally training the models, and each client runs SGD for 2 epochs. What we did is we inserted, we collected these images, right? So, and then we did a lot of, we didn't find 800 images of Southwest planes, but we collected a bunch of them, and we did use data augmentation to create more data points by rotating or flipping and whatever. And we inserted 800 Southwest images in the training set and 200 in the test set. So it is an edge case, but it's not one of those examples where it's absolutely not present in the data. I'll just share a few experiments now. So what we see is the following. So I want to compare sort of or kind of like exhibit the importance of edge case in the following sense. So the general, this green one will always be the general accuracy of the model. The y-axis is test accuracy. The x-axis are the number of distributed iterations or federated learning rounds. I want to see basically, out of those 800 images in the training set, how many of those does the adversary need to hold so that the attack is persistent and successful? So an attack, in the case of backdoors, an attack is successful if it has some reasonable accuracy, right? So if I have an image, I take a picture of whatever, a Southwest plane, and 50%, like, half of the times it tells me that it's a garbage can or like something else, that's a successful attack, right? You don't, the backdoor doesn't have to be 100% successful, unlike general accuracy. So we want to see basically, what is the accuracy on the backdoor task, and this is what these separate lines are, for the case where the adversary holds a different fraction of the data points that we're trying to poison. So for those 800 images, if 10% are owned by the adversary, we see that the task or sort of the backdoor that you're trying to insert cannot really be inserted, right? So that means that actually the adversary or the group of adversaries has to hold something more significant. And we see that even once the adversary holds half of all the images, right? So again, if this is an Aegean plane and there's only, let's say, or Southwest plane and there's only, let's say, 1,000 images of Southwest in the training data, the adversary would have to hold, maybe another 1,000 to successfully insert a backdoor that's accurate, 30% of the times. And then if the adversary holds absolutely all of the planes, you can make this accuracy, go up to like 60 or 70%. And this is quite important, right? Because there's, in this case, there's like only, one adversary out of, 200 nodes. So that's quite interesting. So this is mainly to basically, this figure, I hope, convinces you that edge case backdoors are much easier to inject, right? So if anything, if nothing else, I just want you to take from this that, the more the adversary, the biggest fraction the adversary holds with regards to predictive subtask, let's say, a particular type of plane or animal or, whatever you want, then that makes the attack much more effective. And it makes the attack much more easier, right? So if, if you try to target, let's say, united planes or whatever, there's an abundance potentially of them across users. But if you try like a smaller subclass, then that's much easier for the adversary to collect the image and inject those backdoors. The other quite interesting thing that we observe is the fact that the adversary should not only hold poison data points. So if you only contain, so if I only have, let's say, adversarially labeled southwest planes, the attack is actually not going to work well. You have to mix them locally with clean data points. And in fact, we found that around 20%, like having 20% clean data points and 80% sort of adversarial data points in these attacks actually leads to better accuracy, which I found quite surprising. And I think the reason for that, and this is, kind of like just a conjecture, I don't know what the mathematical sort of reason for this is, but my intuition is that this happens because if you just do training on the sort of the adversarial data, you're going to change the model so much that once you do the averaging, that big change that you've made on the local weights is actually sort of going to be washed out by all the other models. However, if you mix in some sort of clean data points, then the model will sort of look like what you had before. So when those models are mixed back at or average at the parameter server, the averaging with the other local nodes or local models will not affect significantly the accuracy of this backdoor task. But kind of like the high level idea here is that you should be, an adversary should be mixing poison and clean data points for a higher effectiveness of those backdoor attacks. Oops, sorry. The other interesting thing is that we find that if you were to basically insert or control a percentage of attackers, of course, you can control all of them, and that's completely unreasonable, like all of the 200 users. But what we found is that you only need to control roughly between 0.5 to 1% of the users. Arguably, someone may say, okay, this is too big of a fraction, and I would not disagree with you. And this is something we're still looking into. But I guess the main point I want to say is that, and this was also a surprise to me, the percentage of attackers does not have to be 10%, right? So even with like 0.5% of the nodes acting maliciously, you can actually inject those edge case backdoors. And this is, again, particular to edge case backdoors. And I think the most natural question is, okay, so there's been a ton of different defenses for backdoor attacks, and would like to understand whether those defenses work or filter out any of them, the attacks that we suggested. And we tried a bunch of different methods. If you're familiar with the literature, geometric median or norm clipping or cram and multi-cram, you can think of them as sort of variants of a robust mean aggregator. And what we find is across the two different attacks, the black box attacks and the white box attacks, we find that the white box attacks are actually quite hard to basically filter out. So we see, in fact, that whether you use one of those techniques or not to filter out or to whatever to defend against edge case backdoors, you don't see much effectiveness. The only effectiveness you see, and this is quite interesting, is if you only do black box attacks where you only poison the data. What we see is that, for example, cram and multi-cram do tend to actually be quite strong against those types of attacks. But for white box attacks, it seems that sort of all bets are off, and at least these types of defenses are not good enough or strong enough to maintain a good performance on the backdoor tasks. And I guess, yeah, the other thing that's interesting these attacks are also persistent. So, you inject them once, or you inject them, once every 100 iterations, but you don't see kind of like a lag in performance, right? So you don't see kind of like the accuracy going up and then down and then sort of up again. Although they're not, again, they're not injected at every single iteration, they're injected at, 1 out of 100 iterations. The other quite interesting thing, so there's potentially the strongest type of defense was something that's called a weak differential privacy defense, where basically, essentially, you inject noise in your models. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with these type of defenses. And what we find is something quite interesting. So if you add more, differential private-based noise to your models, you do see them. So this orange curve is the accuracy of the backdoor task. You do see that the accuracy of the backdoor task decreases. In fact, you can perfectly filter it out. However, something very interesting happens. If you see what happens to the, if I have a user that has whatever Southwest Airplanes, but with the correct label, the accuracy on Southwest also decreases proportionally. So somehow what this says is that you can filter out an attack, but that sort of noise that you eject is actually going to have a significant impact on your personalization accuracy. And this is where the observation comes that you have to either pick robustness or personalization. And this is in fact a finding that's very similar with Eugene and Vitali had a paper at NeurIPS 2019 where they basically observed the same thing, that personalization and differential privacy are a little bit at odds, at least with regards to federated learning. So if you want to be robust, you can do this and it works, but it will affect actually the the accuracy on the subtask that you're trying to defend against in this process. I think I have 5 more minutes, so I'm almost done. This is, I think, the second to last figure. The only thing I want to say here is that I don't want to go into the precise details, but if you use, beyond differential privacy, if you use, CRUM, the defense that I told you before, that is very effective against black box attacks, what happens is that CRUM filters out a bunch of different users, right? So the quite interesting thing is that if you hold data that just looks diverse enough, or looks like the edge case data that are being injected with backdoors, what happens is that CRUM will actually filter out those data points, or those users, even though they're not adversarial. And we found an interesting discrepancy now between sort of the fairness, if you will, of the way that you treat users, right? So you can literally sort of discriminate against users, just like exclude them from the training just because the data looks diverse enough, although they're not adversarial, right? So again, we see the cost of robustness here. So robustness does not come for free, right? So you can have some form of robustness against those backdoors, but the cost will either be personalization or, in this case, fairness with regards to how you treat the different users in your user base. And I guess the last thing I would like to say is that model capacity also has an impact on those backdoors. The only thing I would like you to get from this figure is that, the more expressive the model you're using, the more inherently vulnerable it will be to backdoors. So, this will not resolve everything, but if you had to choose between a simple model, let's say whatever, a linear classifier or a neural network, the linear classifier is definitely more robust to backdoors. Of course, much less expressive as well. So there's again this interesting trade-off between two quantities that we care about, but they do seem to be at odds: robustness in this case and expressivity. And I would like to conclude and leave room for questions. I would like to skip this, just want to focus on open questions. So in these experiments, we did not look into collusions at all, right? So, different users do whatever they want. The adversarial nodes do whatever they want, and there is no collusion between them, right? So they're not trying to achieve the same goal or whatever. And this is potentially, if you look into colluding adversaries, you open the door to potentially significantly stronger attacks. And this is something that we're actively looking into. I guess the other thing that I find quite interesting is when we talk about robustness, it's a very general definition, right? So if you want to be robust against every sort of backdoor, that's likely not possible. So I think the way to move forward is to maybe limit a little bit the scope, narrow the scope of what we want as what we mean by robustness, and maybe this will make things a little easier, because as it currently stands, we can't do much about it. So if you just want arbitrary robustness to all kinds of backdoors, that implies solving other problems that are much harder than this, and this just does not seem possible. So I think the route towards or the path towards robustness is to probably look more into certifiable defenses. This is something that has been very successful for inference time attacks, where you present a defense and you're like, you don't have to believe my math. Here's a certificate that this defense will work, right? So I think this has been very successful in adversarial examples, and I think can have a lot of promise for training time type of robustness that we care about in this case. But the other interesting thing is that, and this is something that I've been struggling with quite a lot. I talked about what happens if you have access to the algorithms, the API is open and whatnot, but it could be the case that the API itself could be much more secure, that it would not allow arbitrary mislabeling of data points. It would not allow users to have access to the models or the algorithms. And maybe you can guarantee some sort of robustness through that, or even through user verification, right? You say, okay, I don't know, upload something about you, and maybe we can verify your status as a non-adversarial user. But I do think that these three ideas, certifiable defenses, API-based robustness, and user verification, may in fact be at the core of a future path towards federated robustness. So I think this is my last slide, and I would like to conclude here and leave room for questions. Thank you so much for attending, and I'll be happy to discuss with you now.
Thank you, Dimitris. That was a fantastic talk. I'll give you a clap on behalf of the other audience.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Your talk has really stimulated quite a bit of discussion. We have about 5 minutes for questions, so we can't get to everything, but let's run through a few of them. Sure. One interesting question someone posed is, they say, we are contemplating using federated learning for Alzheimer voice translations. The translators are smart parrots connected to edge computers. Should we fear backdoor attacks? Can we protect? And so forth. So I guess this person is coming from a very practical angle. Maybe they want to deploy something quite soon.
Yeah.
What do you think?
This is actually a great question. Yeah. So I think this is a fantastic question. So I think, the answer is the following. So this sort of comes back to the question of like, how much do you control during the learning process, right? So if this is something that's happening in-house, because there's federated learning that can happen in-house with a very sort of controlled set of users. And the one that happens at Google, which is much broader, impacts many more users and whatnot. So if it happens in-house, you can certainly do it, right? But if if there is a part of the training pipeline that you don't control, then for these types of problems, there may be, quite a concern for federated attacks. So and again, if you would like to sort of maybe open the scope and allow other users beyond maybe in-house users to participate in the training, I think verifying users may make sense. So this actually, I just want to say that this sounds like a very exciting application. In fact, I've never heard about it, and I will, I will look into the references.
The link. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, just pivoting from what you just said. How much can trusted hardware help? I've seen some recent work in both in the cloud and on the device, that hardware is maturing, and then people are getting better at working out the algorithmic sort of bottlenecks that exist there. So in that space, how do the things you're discussing today, are they still a big problem? Can they be managed through those means?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I'm not a hardware person, so I'm not quite familiar with the literature, but I did look a little bit into trusted hardware. And in fact, I had a discussion with someone, I don't quite remember who it was, but this sort of like did give me the the idea that the solution may come from hardware and from sort of like even just a process outside of the algorithms, right? Because it just seems that if you want to say, I will treat everything else as a black box, I'll just try to make the algorithms robust, that's just not possible. So I guess that's we should definitely keep in mind that if you're working in the area and you're like, okay, what should I focus on? Don't try to create a defense for a federated learning. It just will not, there will be something that will bypass that defense. But I think working in trusted hardware and working in maybe even how we can bring humans in the loop to verify some of those pipelines, and I think in fact this is what Google is doing. They have dedicated engineers that actually they test their models to death to make sure that these things don't happen, right? So this is another way, not tied to the algorithm, that actually can give a very useful solution. And I do think that the solution will not be algorithmic. I think it will be either hardware or with regards to the more general pipeline of federated learning.
Sounds like these are very deeply sort of set issues. I guess one other question I'll ask is, we're hearing a lot about self-supervised techniques, and they really plays really well with federated learning and moving forward. As that combination matures, what do you think that'll mean for the topics you're talking about today? I guess the issues still remain exactly the same, right? It's still
I wanted to say something about this. So so I think actually self-supervision can in fact help. So if in the sense of labeling, right? So if you say, I have an API that the users cannot hack or whatever, and they don't have access to, and that API is actually going to insert the labels through self-supervision, right? So I take an image of I don't know, a car, right? The label, I don't have any I can't act on the label as a user or adversarial user, but a model will try to give a label that's as accurate as possible for that data point, right? So that overall would lead potentially to a model that's less accurate than actually using user-provided labels, but will protect you from users poisoning the labels, right? So I think this is a case where self-supervision potentially could help. If, however, you said, I want to kind of like just redo exactly what I'm doing, I'm going to use the labels or, whatever, I'll just do self-supervision in a federated setting. As you said, you just have the same type of issues. But I do think that, in terms of how do we assign labels, self-supervision, in fact, may be useful in this case. Yeah.
It may make these poisoning attacks more apparent because of the dependencies that exist between with the labels in that setting. It probably have a lot of structure between them, right? It's hard to kind of fake a bunch of data that have all these dependencies. So maybe it can help in that way. Wow, it's been such a great talk. We all really appreciate hearing from you and kicking off this summit today. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation, and I really enjoyed being here, and I'm looking forward to see the other talks today.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.